The Last of Us plot holes. Let's do this. Something that's been bugging me about The Last of Us. Both the games and the TV show. You know how this is supposed to be a world overrun by infected, right? But when you really think about it, we barely see hordes of infected anymore, especially in the later parts of the story. In the beginning, both the games and show do a great job showing us how the cordyceps infection spread and devastated civilization. We get those intense sequences of people turning and cities falling into chaos. But as the story progresses, especially by the time we get to places like Jackson or the later parts of Seattle, the infected almost feel like an afterthought rather than the main threat. Think about it. Most of the conflict we see revolves around human factions fighting each other. Whether it's the Fireflies, Fedra, the WLF, or the Seraphites, it's primarily human versus human action. The infected appear in specific set pieces or designated dark and spooky areas, but they're not really the omnipresent threat you'd expect from a fungal apocalypse that supposedly wiped out most of civilization. One could argue that maybe the military and survivor groups have gotten really good at clearing out infected from their territories, or perhaps the infected have naturally clustered in certain areas while leaving others relatively clear. But it still feels a bit convenient that they show up mainly when the plot needs a scary moment or to block off a certain path. The reality is, this might be less of a plot hole and more of a conscious storytelling choice. The Last of Us has always been more focused on human drama and the moral complexities of survival, rather than pure zombie horror. The infected serve as a backdrop that created this harsh world, but the real story is about how people adapt, survive, and sometimes lose their humanity in the process. Still, it would be interesting to see more exploration of where all the infected have gone, or maybe get some official explanation about their migration patterns or population decline. For now, it remains one of those things we kind of just accept for the sake of the story, like how nobody ever seems to run out of gas in The Walking Dead. But that's a topic for another video. Next, Ellie's immunity. It's not exactly a plot hole in the traditional sense, but it's definitely one of those things that just happens, without much scientific explanation behind it. Let's look at what we know. Ellie gets bitten. Everyone expects her to turn within 48 hours, like literally every other person who's ever been infected. But she just doesn't. The fungus is there in her system, but it's almost like it's dormant or has reached some kind of weird symbiosis with her body. It's a pretty convenient plot device that kicks off the entire story, right? The real interesting part is how the games and show never really try to explain the science behind it. Sure, we get some vague mentions about her having a mutated cordyceps strain, and there's talk about her body potentially producing some kind of chemical messenger that tricks the fungus. But when you think about it, that's about as detailed as saying, "It's magic, don't worry about it." What makes this even more intriguing is how Ellie seems to be the only known immune person in the entire world. Not a single other case is ever mentioned. In a world with millions of infected people, you'd think there might be at least a handful of others with similar immunity, right? But nope, just Ellie. The show and games use this unexplained immunity as a springboard for all these heavy moral questions and character development. It becomes less about the how and more about the what if. What if you found the one person who could potentially save humanity? What would you sacrifice for that chance? It's pretty clever how they shift our focus from the scientific implausibility to the ethical dilemma. You know what's kind of funny? In most zombie stories, finding a cure or an immune person is usually the endgame, something that happens in the finale. But The Last of Us throws it at us right at the start, then spends its time exploring what that means for the characters rather than getting bogged down in the medical details. In a way, maybe the unexplained nature of Ellie's immunity actually works in the story's favor. It keeps things mysterious and forces us to focus on the human element rather than getting caught up in the scientific explanations that might not be satisfying anyway. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that leave a little bit of mystery in the mix. Next, the seemingly endless supply of gasoline that characters keep using, even though we're about 25 years into the apocalypse. Think about it. In our world, gasoline has a shelf life of around 3 to 6 months before it starts to degrade, maybe up to a year if stored perfectly. Even with fuel stabilizers, you're looking at maybe 2 to 3 years tops. Yet here we are, watching characters ride motorcycles and using generators like it's no big deal. What's really interesting is that they do show some awareness of fuel scarcity. Characters are often searching for gas, and settlements like Jackson clearly value fuel. But the fact that they're finding any usable gas at all is pretty wild. Most gas would have turned into a gross, gummy mess that would wreck any engine trying to use it. You could argue that maybe some communities figured out how to refine new fuel from crude oil. After all, the knowledge still exists, and there are probably some old refineries around. But running an oil refinery? That's not exactly a small operation. You'd need serious infrastructure, expertise, and a lot of working parts that would be hard to maintain after decades of abandonment. The funny thing is, this isn't just a Last of Us problem. Pretty much every post-apocalyptic story struggles with this. Whether it's Mad Max, The Walking Dead, or any other series set years after civilization's collapse, somehow there's always just enough gas to keep the plot moving. What's kind of interesting is how the game does show some alternative methods of getting around. Horses are a big deal in Jackson, and we see a lot of people using bikes and boats. But then they'll throw in a dramatic motorcycle chase or a generator powering up some crucial plot device, and you have to kind of just roll with it. Next, Tommy injury. So here's what goes down. During that intense confrontation with Abby at the theater, Tommy gets shot in the head. Not grazed, not a flesh wound. We're talking about a proper headshot. The next time we see him, he's alive but with a limp and a damaged eye. The game just kind of moves on from there, like it's no big deal. Now let's be real for a second. In a world where basic medical care means scrounging for alcohol and bandages, surviving a headshot is pretty wild. We're not talking about modern hospitals with skilled neurosurgeons and high-tech medical equipment here. We're talking about people who probably have to sterilize their medical tools over campfires. The game doesn't even try to explain how they managed to save him. Did they have a secret brain surgeon hanging out in Jackson? Was there some kind of emergency medical facility we didn't know about? Did Maria have a hidden stash of advanced medical supplies? We get nothing. It's just, hey, Tommy's alive now, he's grumpy, and he has a limp for some reason. The game actually does a pretty good job showing the brutal reality of this world in other situations. We see characters die from much less severe injuries, and the game doesn't shy away from showing how dangerous even small wounds can be in a post-apocalyptic setting. But then Tommy just tanks a headshot, like it's a minor inconvenience. The limp is another weird detail. How does a headshot result in a leg injury? Sure, brain injuries can affect mobility, but the game doesn't really connect these dots for us. It feels like they wanted to show Tommy was permanently affected by the injury, but maybe went a bit overboard with the symptoms. In a game that's all about brutal realism and consequences, this might be the one moment where they said, "Nah, we need Tommy for the plot later, he'll be fine." And hey, I get it. Tommy's an important character, and his survival drives some crucial late-game story beats. But a little explanation would have been nice. So what do you think? Should the game have given us more details about Tommy's survival, or is this just one of those things we're supposed to accept and move on? Also, Joel injury. Joel falls from a decent height and lands right on a rusty metal bar that goes clean through his abdomen. In any realistic scenario, this is pretty much game over. We're talking major organ damage, massive blood loss, and a high risk of infection. And that's assuming it didn't hit anything immediately fatal like the spine or major blood vessels. But what happens in the game? Ellie manages to get him to safety, patches him up with some basic supplies. And after what seems like a relatively short time, mostly spent unconscious during the winter chapter, Joel is back on his feet. He's even fighting and climbing around like nothing happened. The most we see is him holding his side a few times early on. The funny thing is, even basic survival in these conditions would be pretty miraculous. Think about it. No proper medical equipment, no antibiotics, unless they found some that hadn't expired, and definitely no trained surgeons around. Not to mention, this happens in a world where even a small cut could lead to a life-threatening infection. And let's talk about those painkillers Ellie finds. They're definitely not the kind of heavy-duty medication you'd need for an injury this severe. Joel's basically running around, getting into fistfights, and climbing buildings while dealing with what should be a career-ending injury at minimum. But you know what? Sometimes games need these moments where reality takes a back seat to keep the story moving. If Joel had been realistically sidelined by this injury, we wouldn't have gotten some of the most powerful moments in the game's final act. It's one of those cases where the emotional truth of the story matters more than medical accuracy. That's just my take on Joel's surprisingly quick recovery. What do you think? Did this bother you while playing, or were you too caught up in the story to care? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to like and subscribe for more gaming analysis. I'll see you next time.